Lena had been carrying plates all night. The diner smelled like fry oil and coffee and the kind of grease that clung to the cuffs of her jacket and to the soft bruise of her forearms. Her apron was tied the same way it had been since she was 17, not pulled tight, ends tucked under. It kept slipping loose when the rush came. She moved through the narrow floor with a practiced economy. A shoulder leaned past the booth, a foot tucked so it wouldn't clip the leg of a customer. Her hands remembered trajectories, the way an old player's hands remembered the arc of a ball. There was a photograph of Jake on the shelf behind the counter, taped crookedly to a stained menu board. A 17-year-old with a wry smile, a narrow scar at the corner of his eyebrow, and a basketball in his arms. He had been the sort of kid who lived in the arc of a shot. Lena kept the photo because when she looked at it, the apartment above the diner felt like a promise she had to keep. She was used to the city folding into its own nocturnes, the click of heels on wet pavement, the distant low of a train, sometimes the wet thud of a trash bag hitting the alley. Tonight, the sky over the harbor was the color of old glass. Rain had made the streets reflect the neon of a closed pawn shop and the red of a liquor store sign. People were a little braver or a little stupider when the world gleamed like that. She had just cleared a table when the first shout cut through the night. Lena's body reacted before her mind. She heard it as a player hears a whistle. It came from the alley behind the diner, where the back door led to a narrow service lane and the dumpsters that never emptied. Two men, rough voices, the sound of fists on flesh, a scuffle like something from the street, not the controlled swing of a bar fight, but jagged, unpolished violence. Lena set the tray down, knuckles white around the handle. Instinct twined with a memory, a ball at her hip, the way she had once pivoted and flung herself into a throw that could change a game. She didn't think about the diner's policy, or the rent she still owed, or the fact that Jake was asleep, jaw clenched, upstairs. She ran. The alley smelled of hot iron and the sweet sour of old beer. A pale light from a service lamp made long teeth of shadow. Two men had a third between them, and they were working him over, like they had written a list in their heads and were methodically checking it off. The third man was older, thick-set, mid-50s, his suit already ruined where it clung damp against his skin. Blood smeared the collar of his shirt, not grotesque, not cinematic, just a human map of hurt. Lena's first thought was not who he was. Her first thought was that someone was being hurt and it was happening where she could still do something. "Hey!" Her voice was higher than she wanted. A man turned. One of them, broad-faced, inked hand hooked into the other, sneered. "Mind your business, sweetheart." The other pushed the older man again. He stumbled against the dumpster and hit it with a metallic clang that echoed in Lena's chest like a bell. The older man didn't fall. He stood bent, breath rattling, hands at his sides, eyes small and bright as something trapped. Lena had no weapon. She had a tray, two clean plates balanced like a promise. She had a body that remembered how to throw. She had, somewhere under the years of shifts and bills, a player who had been good enough to be noticed, who had been good enough to nearly go away. The scholarship that got tangled in paperwork and pain. The coach who told her to keep going while her mother disappeared into herself. She had the discipline of practice. She also had a sudden, hot clarity. If they hurt him, they could hurt anyone. She could not let that be the shape of tonight. She stepped forward. The men laughed, because fear is loud, and laughter disguises the fact that both of them had a moment where they considered leaving. Lena's palms were steady. "Leave him," she said. No tremor, no plea. The broader man spat. "You don't know what you walked into, girl." Great. He was big, and the alley had trash and metal. Lena's brain cataloged. Distance, footing, line of sight. Her shoulders coiled like a spring. She moved the way she'd moved the ball, only now the weight was a tray instead of leather. She pivoted, put her hips into it, swung. The tray hit the first man's jaw with the dry, stinging sound of a thunderclap. Plates shattered, porcelain flowering on the wet ground. The hit wasn't to maim, it was to break the rhythm. The broad man's head snapped back. Pain blossomed in Lena's palm where the tray had slipped, but that was acceptable. It had worked. The second man blinked, and in the blink, the older man, who had been hollow-eyed and beaten, reached. He grabbed Lena's wrist like a man pulling himself to shore. "Lena," he said, in a voice that cut the alley into a single, strange silence. He wasn't begging. He was saying her name as if it were an answer he had been looking for. She realized then what she had done. The man, whose suit had the cut of someone who favored order, wasn't a random drunk. People in the city who bore themselves like that were rarely alone. On his wrist, the skin was thick where a watch used to be. His haircut was conservative in the way older men paid for. He smelled of a cologne that tried to forget the alley. The two assailants started to circle, enraged by the loss of momentum, by the novelty that a waitress would intervene. Lena's knees were suddenly younger than the rest of her. Memory of rubber soles on court. The older man's hands were on her wrist and then on her shoulder, grounding her. "Go," he said. "Get inside, now." She wanted to ask who he was. She wanted to ask whether he was okay. She wanted, irrationally, to wipe the blood from his shirt with one of the napkins she used at tables. But voices came from deeper in the alley then, shouts, the clanging of something thrown. And Lena did what she had always done. She chose the thing that would keep one heart in a chest and not a corpse on concrete. She ducked away and ran back toward the diner, slipping through the swinging kitchen door like a player folding into a game plan. Inside, she leaned with her forehead against the cool metal of the service pass and breathed through the sting in her palm. The cooks looked at her with mouths open. The manager, Marv, had frozen mid-plug of the line. He finally asked, "Lena, you okay?" "Yeah." Her voice was small. She could have lied, said she had tripped. Instead, she said, "There was a man. They were beating him." Marv's eyes narrowed. "You called the cops?" She had not. She had not thought of it. She thought of Jake, of the thinness of their rent ledger, of the fact that emergency rooms cost money and half measures cost more. She thought of the older man and how keyed his voice had been when he said her name as if it belonged to him already. "No," she said. "They left." She dried her hands on her apron until the itching in her fingers stopped. She felt foolishly, painfully alive. Her wrist throbbed where the old man's grip had been. When Jake came home that night, early morning, he had his shoes in his hands and his jersey folded over his shoulder, and two sleepless eyes that told her he had been shooting under the single stadium light again. Lena listened to the scrape of his sneakers in the hallway and felt the city close around the two of them like a jaw. He dropped a bag of stale gym snacks on the table. "You at work?" he asked, voice low, exhausted. "Yeah," she said, "late shift." He shrugged. "You okay? You look like you fought a mime." She wanted to tell him. She wanted to confess everything, the alley, the plates, the old man's hand. But the confession would come with questions neither of them wanted. Jake was 14 months from skyrocketing out of their apartment and into a scholarship. He did not need a night that made his sister into a story that would follow him onto a bus. "I spilled soup," she said. It was not a lie. The truth was juiced inside like the bottom of an orange. It tasted sharp. Some things had a way of unspooling. The city didn't forget that someone had interfered. Word was a rumor's trailing smoke. It moved faster than the people who started it. The older man had ties that made the rumor spread. In the span of a day, there were men watching the diner from across the street, leaning against the lamppost with hot coffee and eyes like small knives. They didn't answer. They didn't need to. People like that understood the immediacy of observation. Lena noticed them because she could not notice. She moved with the quiet attention of someone who'd learned to read the lanes of a game. She worked double shifts that week, carrying plates like a shield. She locked the door after closing earlier than usual, and when she climbed the stairs, she looked down the fire escape to see if anyone followed. The city smelled like rain and old iron, and something else, fear or opportunity, depending on who breathed it. 3 days after the alley, a black sedan eased past the diner at dusk and slowed. A man in a neat coat slid out and stepped toward the door. Lena was rinsing a coffee pot when he walked in. He stepped like someone who belonged to an order. The way the air folded around him had the tight precision of a man who'd had to cultivate respect. "Miss Chen," he said, and she heard the older man's voice, the one from the alley, in his vows. It fit as awkwardly as a coat that was a size too small. Marco Santo. Her first thought was that she had been right. She had no training for this. She had only the litany of small self-preservations that had kept them fed, the ability to hold on to what mattered and give up the rest. She washed her hands under the cold tap until the water ran clear and went out to meet him. Marco Santo was not swagger. He was a man who carried the weight of a lot of decisions in his chest, a man whose face had lines carved by calculation rather than vice. He had been cleaned and bandaged since the alley. His shirt had a new collar where a tailor had made something less ragged of it. He didn't smell like the alley. He smelled like men who used the world like a ledger. "You saved my life," he said without preamble, as if saying so was a fact as simple as closing the door. Lena felt her mouth go dry. She had expected money or a threat or tips about being careful. None of that was offered. Marco's voice wore an odd softness. "You put yourself in front of them." She shifted her weight, the practiced motion of a person who was always thinking of escape. "They hurt you," she said. "It wasn't safe." "It wasn't," Marco said, "and yet you acted like it was." The city had taught Lena a posture for dealing with men like him: polite distance, quick calculations, no attachments. But there was something in his eyes that made her pulse recalibrate. He looked at her as if he saw the arc she had thrown decades ago, as if he recognized a player in an alley. "Why are you talking to me?" she asked. Most people leave," he finished for her. "Most people do not get in the way." He handed her a card. The paper was thick. On it, in simple type, was a name and a number. "This is not a favor," he said. "It is a debt. If you ever need something, if there is ever a time I can return what you did, you call." Lena's hands closed around the card the way a player holds a ball at the free throw line. She didn't take it because she wanted to step into the world he represented. She took it because the world didn't provide neat edges. "I don't want to be in anything," she said. "I've got a brother to care for." His look softened into something like the memory of a younger man. "I respect that," he said. "Protect him." After he left, Lena sat on the back step and watched him merge into the pattern of the city, the way a ship becomes only a shape in the harbor. She had saved a man who knew how to keep men in line. It should have been a closed ledger. It was not. Word traveled, and not in the way that cards and numbers did. Vincent Russo heard the rumor: a boss beaten in an alley, a waitress intervening. Vincent liked symbols, hard and sharp. He was younger than Marco, and where Marco carried codes, Vincent carried a hunger like a bruise. The rumor reached him as a sliver that sharpened. He liked to take advantage of incidents that split the air. He saw a boss who had been made vulnerable. He saw an opportunity to tilt the table. He pushed in the right directions. He muttered to the right ears. He did not yet show his hand. Instead, he pressed, quietly, in a way that suggested patience. In weeks, the city started to change color for Lena. Men in cheap suits standing a block away. A van that hummed with something like attention. Cameras in doorways she had not noticed before. The diner began to feel like a node on a map. People with intent had ways of turning small acts into leverage. Marco, when he could, came back to the diner. He always ordered coffee with 2 sugars and never accepted more than what she could give. He would sit in the corner and listen more than he spoke, the way an old man listens for the beat of a heart. He never pressured her to be involved. He never offered money outright. But he watched the people who watched Lena. He spoke sometimes, quietly, of protection in a language that refused to be named. "You did what was necessary," he told her once. "That was bravery." "Bravery sounds different when people advertise it," Lena said. "Mine felt like panic." Marco smiled without humor. "We all have to pick what we are willing to bear," he said. "You picked something I value." The city tightened.
A safe house on the other edge of Old Harbor, where Enzo kept a spare room, caught fire one night when someone stole a cigarette and threw it into a pile of rags. It was determined later that the blaze was an attack, an escalatory thumb snap. Marco lost a lieutenant who had been more than a lieutenant and less than a son. Vincent moved his pieces. The skirmishes became not ad hoc affairs, but surgical pushes in a chess game. Lena felt the heat of it. Her life, already narrow as a hallway, contracted further. The men who liked to stand and watch began to cross the street, sit at the corner booth, fold napkins with hands that indicated other things. Jake made the team at school and slept with his jersey at the foot of the bed, proud as a kid who'd been given a small kingdom. Lena began to measure threats not only by the presence of men, but by how long Jake stayed out each night, by whether he took the long way home. She wanted distance. She wanted, more than anything, the old life. Plates, tips, the easy geometry of the court that used to be the world. She wanted to be the person who could go to practices and come back with a tired, clean mind. Instead, her nights were threaded with surveillance and small choices. Which window to leave open, what route to take home from closing, when to answer the diner's phone. The city was in her bones. It was Enzo who finally made the offer that couldn't be refused. He arrived at the diner with an unremarkable face and a scarf tight around his neck. He had the hands of a man who'd handled things others preferred not to think about. He had lore, how a city keeps itself stable when the edges come loose. He spoke in practicalities rather than threats. "You have a boy upstairs," he said simply. "We can make sure he stays safe. We can make sure you do not have to look over your shoulder." Marco had said similar things, but Marco wore them like an oblate, like a weight. Enzo offered them like tools. "We're not asking you to fight," Enzo added. "We are offering help. Accept it." Lena thought of Jake's laugh as he practiced a dribble in the dark of the gym, thought of the scar on the corner of his brow that came from falling off a bicycle when he was 7 and trying to play tougher than he was. She thought of the way he ate when she brought soup home, like someone who had been told a story and believed the person telling it. She wanted nothing for him to be taken by it.
This city with its appetite for advantage. "What's the catch?" she asked. Enzo considered. "Trust," he said. "We will ask no service you are not willing to give, but your life will be quieter." Quiet was a promise. It sounded like a beach, impossible and desirable. Lena signed the invisible receipt with a nod she gave to herself in the mirror. It bought them breathing room for a while. Marco arranged for a guard detail in the corners of their block, men who would sit with an air of having nowhere to be. Enzo's people swapped the security cameras that looked toward the diner for different models. The old worn tapes replaced with ones that hummed and rarely recorded anything of interest. The city shifted, but so did the stakes. Vincent was patient. He demanded more than an alley scuffle. He demanded leverage. An ambush was, in the city's vocabulary, a punctuation mark. It was meant to both hurt and send a message. Lena learned its rhythm the night Jake got included. She had never seen him as blind to danger. He'd gone with friends to the stadium after practice to shoot around late, the way kids do. Lights left on, a custodian humming somewhere. Lena told him not to. He promised anyway. She found out when someone banged on the back door 3 nights later. Lena was clearing away a lonely booth and had a towel over her shoulder. The man outside was breathless and his eyes were wide. "They took him," he said. "They took Jake." The word broke across her like cold glass. She had no plan. She had only the pattern of a player. Observe, pivot, throw. She ran up the stairs, up 2 flights, past the scuffed door to their apartment. The place smelled like cheap laundry and the faint stink of laundry soap. Jake was gone, and the window was ajar, the curtain moving like a hand in the dark. Panic had its own crystalline logic. Enzo's people had a van waiting. Marco had already texted directions. Lena's hands shook as she packed a small bag. A sweatshirt for Jake, a bar of soap, a folded photograph. She left the kettle to boil and the keys on the counter, like a promise.
She followed because you followed the thing you have always followed: family. They traced steps through the city's backrooms, an abandoned rail yard, a pier where the fog hugged the pilings like a secret, a lot of hungry people who smiled for cash. They found Jake at the derelict stadium, knees scraped, breathing hard, surrounded by men with short eyes and long agendas. Lena's chest contracted with a sound that was less a scream than a pull of breath into weighted lungs. She had been lucky once. Luck, she knew finally, wasn't a strategy. She stepped into the stands where he was. Men looked up. The light was low and the smell of old sweat and dust came up from the cracked rubber seats. Jake,
Eyes found her and softened in a way that made her bones go warm. He walked toward her with a hesitant grin, the sort that came from someone who'd been scolded and forgiven in the same inhale. "You're here," he said. "I'm always here," Lena said, and meant it. It should have been the end of the matter. They should have gone home. But the city doesn't always give neat endings. Vincent listened when people spoke. He had ears and a taste for leverage. He had learned where the edges of Marco's loyalty frayed, and he moved them like a hand on a loose wire. Weeks slid into a cold calculus. There were small victories, detectives who accepted that they would need to tread carefully, a neighbor who offered to keep the building's back corridor lit. There were small losses, too. A trusted courier vanished overnight. A safe house burned, not from accident, but from the clean fold of a match. Lena learned to hold her breath in the spaces between heartbeats. She learned to sleep sitting up, eyes open to shadow. In the middle of it all, Marco kept showing up at the diner. Sometimes he brought coffee. Sometimes he brought nothing, just sat at the counter in that slow, watchful way and listened. Sometimes he spoke in parable about the city, the way old men spoke about weather, unpredictable and capable of change. "You did not have to do what you did in the alley," he told her one night while Jake practiced a new shot at the gym and the walls vibrated with the sound of the ball slapping leather. "You chose." She thought of pride, of the way people asked for nothing, then found themselves owing a debt. "It wasn't a choice," she said finally. "It was the only thing to do." He nodded, as if agreeing with a truth that lived outside of judgment. "You have something they do not," he said. "You have a way of acting that turns the direction of a fight. That is a talent." Her laugh came short. "I'm a waitress." "A waitress with hands that remember how to throw," he corrected. "And those hands matter." She wanted to push him away. She wanted to be fewer things to fewer people. But Marco's presence was that of someone who had already seen what would happen if he did nothing. He had seen systems tip into ruin. He had seen how a city chews up those who think they are merely spectators. He'd been torn himself between a code and the violence that codes become. The violence escalated. Vincent began to play clearer cards. He hit at the edges. The suppliers who had sometimes sold produce to the diner were warned off. A rumor that the cook had slept through a shift and thus ruined the supplier's contract spread like smoke. The diner lost deliveries and profits tightened. Lena could feel the tightening in her stomach like a band. Then, one night, the factory, where Enzo kept a stash of records and cash, was the scene of a raid. Not by the law, by men who had the patient cruelty of those who would remove options. The factory's windows thudded inward, and the smoke that rose from it when it burned was black and thick and smelled like the end of something. Lena watched the glow in the distance from the diner's roof and felt, as if from outside her body, the city pivot on its axis. They moved again. Marco rearranged things in a way that felt like a concession. He took steps behind the scenes that pulled his people into a different formation. He told Lena quietly, "There will come a moment when you will be asked to use what you've always used." She thought of the handball court, of the way the ball had once felt like an extension of her arm. She thought of the scholarship that had been promised and then swallowed by other people's mistakes. "I'm not a fighter," she said. "You are a person who can choose to protect," he replied. "Sometimes the line between the two is thin." And then, as if on cue, the city presented a scenario that would test that line. Vincent struck where it would hurt most. He ordered Marco's lieutenant, one of his oldest men,
taken in broad daylight at a market. The attack was quick and brutal, and broadcast in a way that suggested not only violence, but impunity. Marco's response was the kind of clean, cold strategy that belongs to men who have wires running under their skin. He moved pieces. He ordered a meeting at the factory and asked Lena to be present as an observer. He wanted her to see what would happen when systems confronted systems. When Lena arrived, the factory smelled like oil and old metal. It had been repaired after the fire, its skeleton cleaned and patched, as if the city itself refused to be humiliated by a blaze. Men stood in groups like loose punctuation. Marco's voice carried. Vincent's absence was a calm that suggested malice. The room hummed with something like the static before a storm. "You did not have to bring her," Marco said quietly into Lena's ear. "I wanted to know," she answered. She wanted to understand the size of the world that had stepped into theirs, the mechanisms that could end a life with a fist and a whispered order. Marco's eyes moved across the room like a man checking his board. "You watch," he said. "You learn. No promises." That night, words spread like ripples. Men stood and argued. Allegiances shifted. Lena felt, from the edge of being 23 and working 2 jobs, like an ant in a city that had teeth. She tried to keep her shoulders level, to not let the world see the cracks that formed under pressure. She had been what she was because the city had taught her to survive. It was on the night of the stadium benefit, an odd, ill-fitting charity event that tried to stitch together appearances and money, that the worst of it happened. The stadium was full of faces that wanted to look away from the city's edges. It smelled of overpriced food and the faint musk of antiseptic. Jake was there with friends, cheering a team that meant more to him than anything in the world. Lena had come with a plate and a tray and a nervousness she could not name. She scanned the crowd. Vincent was a rumor and a silhouette. Marco sat further away, his presence small in the noise. Lena moved between tables, a ghost in an apron, and her eye fell on 2 men at the far end of the concourse who had the look of people who had rehearsed their indifference. They watched, not the game, but a man arriving in a crisp suit that exhaled authority. Marco moved through the crowd with the care of someone used to being visible and invisible at the same time. Then the fight began. It was sudden as a dropped plate. 2 men, faces unknown to Lena, appeared at Marco's shoulder and struck. Whoever they were, they hit with the improvisational violence, not coordinated, but brutal in intention. The stadium's polite murmur shattered. People shouted. The 2 men drove Marco into a service corridor, and the concourse doors banged shut behind them. The sound of fists on a body made Lena's stomach flip. She ran. Her movements were reflex and muscle memory. She flashed past concession stands, crowds parting like sea. Jake looked up as she passed him, confusion in his face that turned into alarm. "Lena!" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her whole life narrowed to the sound of bodies hitting concrete and the knowledge that if she did not step in, the man in the suit would not walk away. She reached the service corridor and found Marco on his knees, blood on his temple where someone had hit him with the flat of their palm, and 2 men twisting his arm. They were strong and younger, and they moved with a coolness that made Lena's head clear as ice. There was no audience here, only metal doors and echo. 2 men beat up a mafia boss until a waitress intervened and saved his life. She didn't plot. She did the simplest thing she knew. She used her body as a thing that could alter trajectory. She grabbed a tray from a passing catering cart and swung. The first man paid attention to the ringing crash and pivoted. That was all she needed. She moved in the way a practiced hand moved, low center of gravity, a hip that pivoted to shift momentum. Her hands found purchase at her wrist. A throw she had practiced in half-dead gyms and cheap courts arced, and one man stumbled, then fell. The second man lunged. Lena ducked. She felt a fist graze her cheek, and the world went to slow motion.
The grain of the light, the dust motes, the smell of burnt sugar from concessions.
She felt something inside her break the way a muscle remembers an old pattern and obeys. She grabbed the man's forearm and twisted his balance with a motion she had used to evade defenders, not to beat. Marco crawled. He pressed his weight against the painted line on the concrete, like a compass. The men tried to stand and regroup, but the alarm had started, and the stadium lights flared. People were yelling now. Lena's lungs burned. She had a taste in her mouth like pennies. One of the assailants reached for a knife, then thought better of it. He hesitated. That brief doubt is all Lena needed. She drove forward and the man folded around himself. Not because she was invincible, but because she had shifted a moment's outcome, the smallest of clean interruptions in a planned violence. When it was over, there was an odd hush. The older man, Marco, sat back against the maintenance door and looked at her. He had a cut that wept a little at his temple, and his hand shook where it touched his face. He was not the invulnerable figure Lena had first seen in the alley. He was deeply, humanly bruised. "Why?" Marco asked, voice ragged. "Because you were getting beat," Lena said, finally. The simplicity of it struck both of them. He reached out, as if to take her hand, and then thought better of it, folding back into the posture of a man who was used to not asking for help. Around them, people were calling security, and the stadium staff were moving in with the lumbering efficiency of an institution. Police sirens were close. A man who had been working concessions hovered with a towel outstretched, the kind of small kindness that made a city live. The two attackers were gone, melted into the mass of retreating people. Their absence felt like a cliff edge. Lena's knees trembled. Jake found her then, face pale, breath on his shoulders. He clung to her like a tether. "You okay?" he asked. His voice had the thinness of fear. She nodded. "Yeah." Later, after the paramedics had taken Marco to the ambulance, and after the stadium's announcement interrupted the broadcast with something gauzy like an isolated disturbance, Marco came to their apartment. He moved through the small place with the cautious reverence of a man who visits a life he did not make himself. He sat at their table and looked at Jake as if he were a ledger entry, not in a clinical way, but in a way that measured worth. "I owe you a debt," Marco said to Lena. He'd said it before, differently. This time, the words had weight. "You don't owe me anything," she said. She had learned the vocabulary of refusal. But there was something in the way he watched Jake, something like promise, that was harder to simply refuse. Marco tapped a business card. On the table, the same thickness as before. "Not money," he said. "A different offer. I can make introductions, a stable job, a place for Jake to train that isn't this neighborhood, a way out if you want it." Lena listened. For the first time in years, the idea of a future had the plausibility of an opening. She had pinned all her choices on survival until the moment the city had forced her hand. Now, someone with resources was asking her to bend not for the city, but for herself. "Why?" she asked. "Why help me?" Marco looked down at his hands. "Because you did something no one else would," he said, "and because I have lived long enough to know what I want not to lose." She thought of the factory, the burned safe houses, the smoky long nights of watch. She thought of the ball, and the way it used to feel like a command center in her hands. "I don't want to be in your world," she said. "You won't," Marco promised. "You'd be in a program, training for scholarship. Jake would have a coach with a name that means someone will notice him. You would be training as well, work that pays and gives you time. It's not charity, it's structure. There are offers in life that come like tides. They brush the sand and retreat. Some come with undertows." Lena weighed the risk like a hand turns a ball, feeling for imperfections. "I'll think about it," she said, "but it has to be Jake's decision." He nodded. "Of course." Outside, the city hummed. Inside, Lena folded her hands over the card until it creased the edges. She had saved a life, and it had expanded the world in ways she hadn't expected. The debt was not simple. The world never rewards bravery with neat answers. It layers them like sediment. She thought of the stadium, the echo of sneakers on wood, The way Jake's eyes glinted when he matched an impossible shot. That night, Lena dreamt of a ball. She threw it, and the trajectory hit something, and the world opened. When she woke, the card lay on the table like a small sun. She had no illusions that touching Marco's world would remove danger. She only knew that sometimes you had to step into a room with ghosts in order to build a life that wasn't guided by them. What she didn't know was how much the choices she made in the next days would draw lines that could not be easily erased, or how Vincent Russo would move pieces in answer, like a player who had noticed how one small interception had changed the game's rhythm. She didn't know, in the quiet of the apartment and the smell of cold coffee, that the city's appetite was only beginning to test the edges of what she would protect. Outside, a rain started again, soft at first and then insistent. Lena stood at the window with the card in her palm and watched the street glisten. She thought of the alley, the tray, the way she had stepped between a man and harm. She thought of Jake, and of every small kindness that had kept them fed. She closed her fist around the paper and made a decision without knowing how far its reach would be. The ball was in motion. There were more moves to come. The city was patient. Men like Vincent were not meant to be defied without cost. Lena had made a choice that would set events in motion that required more than the agility of her arms. It required planning, courage, and the willingness to ask for help while refusing to become someone she did not recognize. The first crack came quietly, the sort that went unnoticed until it opened into something larger. A car that had been parked down the block burned one night, its engine a slow funeral. A courier who delivered produce to the diner didn't come the next morning. Pieces of the network began to unravel. And then, one evening, a message arrived at the diner. A photograph slipped under the door, folded, heavy. Lena opened it in the back room where the light was dim, and found a picture of Jake standing at the edge of a court, his jersey damp with sweat, his face in profile. On the back, written in a hand that had no care for politeness, were 3 words: "We are watching." Lena felt the paper burn in her hands without heat. The city had shifted from suggestion to demand. The choice she had made that night in the alley had become a fulcrum. Now the question wasn't whether she would accept Marco's offer. It was whether she could protect the life she had built for her brother without losing herself to the machinery that offered the protection. The stage was set. Men were already moving their pieces. And Lena, waitress, former player, sister, stood at the center of an orbit she had never asked to be in, with a ball under her palm and the echo of a shout in her ears. She texted Marco, "Meet me at the old rail yard, now." He replied, 30 minutes. Bring nothing you are not willing to lose." She left the diner in her coat, the rain a thin whip on her face. The city moved around her with indifferent speed. The rail yard smelled of rust and train grease and a deep old quiet. It was the sort of place that lent itself to decisions and to the kinds of compromises men in power made. She waited by a cold platform, the ball of her palm pressing the card until the edges softened. When Marco arrived, he had the look of a man who had slept too little and fought too many small wars. Enzo was with him, eyes steady. There was a plan in their faces that made Lena's chest both heavier and steadier. Jake's photo lay on the table between them, like a small banner. "We're going to move him," Marco said without preamble, "out of the city for a while. Vincent's is tightening. We need to buy time." "Who?" Lena asked. "Jake," Marco said simply. Lena's mouth went dry. "You can't." "We can and we will," Marco cut in. "But we need you. I can't make it work without you." She realized then how little she had offered her life as a thing for other strategies. She also realized how much she would fight to keep what belonged to her. "And what do I get in return?" she asked. She knew the language of bargaining better than most. She had learned it from a city that taught you to pay attention to what was not said. "Safe house," Enzo said. "A coach, a stipend, a chance for Jake to train with people who will keep him out of the neighborhood. And for you, a job at our facility, something that isn't the diner, something stable. Lena felt the tug of it like a physical ache. Stability had a gravitational pull she could not deny. And the price? She asked. Marco's eyes met hers with the calm weight of a man who knew how to make bargains that preserved reputation. You will take a small risk, he said. Act as a link. Be there for Jake. If needed, help us move him out. Lena's fingers tightened on the card in her hand. The city had constricted into an equation. She had no illusions. She did not like the world she was stepping into, but she would do anything for Jake. Okay, she said finally, one condition. Name it. You tell no one, she said. Not the diner staff, not the neighbors, not my friends, not anyone. Marco nodded. It stays here, Lena. We do not take names. She left the rail yard as rain began again, and for the first time in a long while she felt like she had chosen a side, not out of panic, but out of deliberate care. The city still hummed with appetite, and Vincent still moved his chessmen. But Lena had made a choice to move forward with intention. The ball had been launched. Now it would be a matter of how it landed, and how many people would have to get bruised for it to find the net. She didn't know then that Vincent had seen the exchange from a distance, and that his quiet patience would turn to a push that would test every tether she had. She didn't know that men she had thought only as rumor would become presence, and that the city's appetite for leverage would not be satisfied with mere intimidation. All she knew was that Jake would be moved. The first step was to get him to the coach Marco had arranged, a low-slung gym in a neutral part of town. They planned a trivial route. Take this bus, then a cab, then
from waiting under the gilded light of a gas station. It should have been simple. The city had a way of complicating simple things. They moved under cover of a night that smelled of rain and oil. They slipped through the edges. Lena watched the rearview mirror. She counted the cars that passed them like tiny indifferent clocks. She kept her hand on Jake's knee until he fell asleep against the window. He whispered in his sleep a name that belonged to youth, Coach. They were nearly home to safety when headlights flared behind them like the appetite of a thing that had finally decided to act. A car pulled in front of the van and blocked it, doors opening with quiet hands. Men surrounded the vehicle like wolves. Lena's hands tightened on the wheel. Her skin prickled. They had stolen the easy arc of things and turned it into an ambush. The first man to step forward wore a face like a question and a bulletproof vest. He spoke no words. He raised his hand only to point, a single precise movement. The men who emerged had the look of those who had been rehearsed in the art of closing space. Lena felt the whole world compress into the split-second calculus of how to keep Jake safe when forces larger than her wanted him. There was no time for plans. There was only the same thing she had done in the alley, in the stadium, in every corner where violence had asked for escalation. Act. The arc she had thrown earlier in her life now needed to be applied not to a ball, but to a person, to a narrow corridor of motion. She thought of the trainer's voice in her ear, of the geometry of a throw. She glanced at Jake, asleep, his face soft as a child's. She thought of all the nights she'd carried the weight of their tiny world. She opened the door. The rain slapped at her face like a warning. The men moved with the confidence of those who think they have established dominion. Lena's knees were younger than her age. She could feel the callus of 1,000 court practices in her feet. She stepped out right into the circle of men. The air was electric and tasted of oil. One of them moved toward her. He was big, confident in the way of the uncomplicated. Lena's first response was a small prayer-like focus. She had no weapons, only muscle memory and the knowledge that a body could be used like a tool. She feinted with her shoulder, dropped low and drove forward. Her shoulder hit him in the place that unmade a stance. He staggered back, cursing. The sound of the world rearranging itself was a thing she had never loved but had learned to respect. Men shifted, hands went for holsters. Another moved to Jake's door. Lena lunged and used her body to fold around the threat, grabbing
Wrists, twisting, doing what she had always done when the world demanded immediate, kinetic answers. She felt a fist graze her cheek. Pain flared, bright and hot, but it sharpened her listening. The men were not invincible. They were opportunists with bravado. Her motion was not graceful. It was effective. Shouts came from other corners, and then tires squealed, and men who were allies to either side dove into the fray. Lena's hands were on a man she had never met, and Ilya's, no, she didn't know his name. There were too many names. The van rocked. The rain blurred the lights. A man pulled a gun, and in a city that had learned the cost of escalation, that single movement changed everything. People screamed, and ducks took cover. The world reduced to a single white line: do not let the gun be raised. It wasn't a clean thing. It never is. Steel meets flesh. Decisions have consequences. A shot rang out. The rain swallowed the sound, and the man slumped like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Lena's heart hammered a drumbeat that felt like bone. She stood in shock while the city around her moved like an angry tide. The door on Jake's side sprang open, and a hand, firm and steady, grabbed him and pulled him into a dark van that smelled like motor oil and the faint sweetness of fear. When Lena turned, a man she had not seen, pale, upset, hands slightly shaking, was standing with a training gun, still hot with the echo of a shot, and eyes the color of someone who had not expected to be a killer tonight. He looked at Lena as if asking a question. "What, okay?" he asked, voice small. She wasn't. But she wasn't going to be undone by the city's cruelty. She wasn't going to let Jake be taken with the ease of a streetlight switching off in the rain. Her choices had been made. She would bear them. They drove off, headlights blurring into the wet night. Lena kissed the back window and didn't know if she was promising him safety or cursing herself. In the aftermath, sirens arrived like an indifferent chorus. Men dispersed into the city's veins. The van was gone. Jake had been taken. And in an instant that flattened the meters of joy they had had, the city had taken a hold. At the diner, Lena sat with her hands folded over a cup of coffee gone cold. Marco's phone vibrated against the counter like a drawn sword. His eyes looked older than they had any right to be. "We did not expect that," he said simply. She leaned forward and for once didn't have the tidy answers. What now? Marco's jaw worked. "We get him back," he said. "We find the men who took him. We undo this." Lena's chest tightened around a new kind of fear, the knowledge that there would be consequences not only for those who had stolen her brother, but for the people she had aligned herself with. The ledger of acts and debts tightened. Men like Vincent took actions that were meant to teach lessons. Marco had power and influence, but even he had to balance the scales. The city had rules, and they could be bent. She had set a ball in motion that night in the alley when she had chosen to intervene. Now, the ball had run into a wall and cracked. The game's stakes had changed. There would be more nights like this, more decisions that asked her to step into motion or to shrink and let things take their course. Lena didn't know if she was brave or reckless. She only knew the shape of the decision she would make next. She would not accept that Jake, who had the whole of a future in his palms, would be traded away because of a power play in an office with better light and worse ethics. Marco rose from his seat then, a man who had lived so long that his posture had become economy. "We go tonight," he said. "We go with a plan and with what force we must. Vincent will think he has sent a message. We'll show him messages have replies." Lena felt something in her tighten like a string pulled taut. She was not a soldier. She was a sister who had once been a player, whose palms still remembered how to throw. The city had thrown a gauntlet. She would pick it up. She put her hand over Marco's on the counter. It was a small thing, the press of fingers, a human sign that she accepted the cost. He nodded, and the lines of his face softened for the first time since the alley. Outside, rain had begun to come down harder, washing the street signs into mirrors. Lena looked up at the sky and let the cold wet splatter her cheeks like a baptism she hadn't expected to need. She thought of the stadium, of the ball in her palm,
of the way she had stepped forward without thinking. The city was a dangerous teacher. It demanded sacrifices. Lena would find a way to pay that debt without letting it eat the life of her brother. The night was long. Decisions would be made. Men with names like Vincent's would move their pieces. Marco would marshal his. Enzo would open doors. And Lena, waitress, protector, former athlete, would stand in the middle of it and throw with everything she had. This was not the end. It was the moment before the hospital corridor of action, the cue to run faster. The ball was in motion. The factory was waiting. The men were already circling their parts in a game that would demand everything Lena had built and more. She had saved a life in an alley, and in doing so had found herself pulling her brother across the center of a citywide war he had done nothing to deserve.
The stakes had become clear. Jake's safety, Marco's survival, and Lena's sense of who she was. They were all threaded together now, taut as a wire. She stood, pushed back her chair, and walked into the rain.